The easiest lie to believe is the one wrapped in confidence. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Maple House as another busy evening settled over downtown Seattle. The restaurant glowed with warm amber light, offering shelter from the gray weather outside. Business travelers loosened their ties. Families shared dinners. Couples leaned closer across candlelit tables. The atmosphere felt ordinary, comfortable. Yet before the night ended, one simple conversation would quietly unravel a carefully constructed illusion. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with practiced grace. At 28 years old, she had worked at the Maple House long enough to know that people revealed themselves in small ways. The way they treated staff, the way they reacted to delays, the way they spoke when they believed no one important was listening. Most customers never noticed how observant she was. They saw a waitress carrying trays and refilling coffee cups. They rarely noticed the intelligence behind her calm smile. An old silver watch rested on her wrist beneath the cuff of her uniform. It had belonged to her grandfather. Whenever life became complicated, she found herself glancing at it. Not because it told time particularly well anymore, because it reminded her that patience often revealed more than questions ever could. Near 7 o'clock, the front door opened. A tall man stepped inside, shaking rain from his dark coat. He appeared to be in his early 40s. Well-dressed, composed, the kind of man accustomed to moving through the world without obstacles. Yet something about him immediately felt unusual, not suspicious, deliberate, as though every detail had been carefully selected before he walked through the door. The hostess greeted him and offered a table near the windows. He accepted politely. When Claire received the section assignment, she picked up a menu and approached. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Maple House." The man looked up and smiled. "Good evening." His voice carried a refined European accent. Smooth, confident, almost theatrical. Claire handed him a menu. "Can I start you with something to drink?" The man studied her for a moment before answering. "Perhaps a coffee. Black." The accent remained flawless, at least to most ears. Claire nodded politely. "Of course." She turned toward the kitchen, then paused almost imperceptibly. Half a second. Nothing more. Most people would never have noticed. The man certainly did not. Yet something in his speech had caught her attention. Not a mistake exactly. More like a note played slightly out of tune in an otherwise beautiful song. Claire continued walking. Her expression never changed. Several minutes later, she returned with the coffee. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind him. The city lights beyond the glass blurred into gold and silver reflections. "Thank you," the man said. Again the accent appeared. Again Claire noticed tiny inconsistencies hidden beneath its polished surface. She placed the cup gently on the table. "You are very welcome." The man smiled. "You seem unusually calm for such a busy evening." Claire returned the smile. "People are usually more important than schedules." The answer seemed to interest him. He leaned back slightly. "That is an uncommon perspective." Claire glanced briefly at the old watch on her wrist. Perhaps, for the first time, the man appeared intrigued. Not by the restaurant, not by the menu, by her. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, neither of them yet realized they had already begun a game only one person understood was being played. The evening continued, settling comfortably around the Maple House. Rain traced winding paths down the glass, while customers sought warmth beneath soft golden lights. Claire Bennett moved steadily between tables, balancing orders and conversations with the effortless rhythm that came from years of experience. Yet every few minutes, her attention drifted back toward the man near the window. Not because he demanded attention, because he seemed determined to create a very specific impression. Ethan Whitmore lifted his coffee cup and watched Claire from across the room. He had spent years studying people. As the founder of a successful technology company, he had built a reputation for reading character quickly. Too quickly, some would say. Over time, he developed unusual habits. One of them involved testing strangers, investors, executives, employees, even waiters and waitresses. He believed people revealed their true nature when confronted with someone they assumed was different from themselves. Tonight's experiment seemed simple enough. A carefully practiced accent, a fictional background, a harmless conversation. Then he would observe. Most people either exaggerated their politeness or became subtly dismissive. Ethan had seen both countless times. What he had not expected was Claire. She returned carrying a basket of fresh bread and placed it neatly on the table. "Are you visiting Seattle for business or pleasure?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "A bit of both. I travel often." The accent flowed smoothly. "That must be interesting." "Sometimes." He paused. "I spent most of last month in Europe." Claire nodded politely. "That sounds exhausting." The answer surprised him. Most people asked questions. Which countries? Which cities? Which adventures? Claire simply acknowledged the statement and moved on. Ethan studied her expression. Nothing suggested skepticism. Yet somehow he felt as though she was listening to something beyond his words. "You do not seem impressed by travel," he said. Claire laughed softly. "I think people are more interesting than places." Ethan smiled. Another unusual answer. Perhaps. She glanced briefly toward the rain outside. People tend to carry their stories with them. The conversation lingered in his mind long after she walked away. Meanwhile, Claire entered an order into the computer near the kitchen. One of the newer servers approached. "Window table seems friendly." Claire smiled. "He is certainly interesting." "Tourist." Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Maybe." The younger server laughed. "That sounds like a no." Claire simply picked up another tray. She never explained further. Back at his table, Ethan reviewed the details of the identity he had created for the evening. Years living abroad. European education. International consulting work. The story was detailed enough to withstand casual conversation. At least that was the intention. Yet something about Claire made him unexpectedly cautious. Not because she challenged him, because she never seemed eager to. Most people entered conversations trying to prove something. Claire appeared content, simply observing. An hour passed. The restaurant grew busier. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Every interaction between them remained perfectly pleasant. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible tension had begun to form. Ethan believed he was conducting an experiment. Claire seemed perfectly willing to participate. The difference was that only one of them thought the outcome remained uncertain. As she refilled his coffee for the second time, her eyes paused briefly on him before she smiled. Calm, professional, unreadable. And somewhere behind that smile rested a quiet certainty Ethan had not noticed yet. The kind of certainty that comes when someone already knows the answer and is simply waiting for the question to reveal itself. By 8 o'clock, Ethan Whitmore had become increasingly fascinated by the woman serving his table. The fascination was unexpected. His original plan had been simple. Observe, test, leave. Instead, he found himself extending the conversation whenever Claire Bennett approached. There was something unusual about her calmness. Most people adjusted their behavior depending on who they believed they were speaking to. Claire did not. She treated every guest with the same respectful attention, whether they ordered a cup of coffee or the most expensive meal on the menu. Ethan watched her move through the restaurant. She remembered names, noticed empty glasses before anyone asked, smiled at tired parents, helped an elderly couple with their coats. Every action appeared effortless, yet he suspected it came from years of deliberate practice. Outside, rain continued falling steadily. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warmth. Ethan decided it was time to make the test more interesting. When Claire returned with his dinner, he offered another carefully prepared detail from his fictional life. "This meal reminds me of a small cafe near Vienna," he said. The accent flowed smoothly. "I used to visit every winter." Claire placed the plate gently on the table. "That sounds lovely." Ethan nodded. "The owner made the best coffee in Austria." Claire smiled. "That is a difficult title to earn." "Very difficult." He seemed pleased with himself. Claire glanced briefly toward the rain outside. "Did you spend much time there recently?" "Several months last year." The answer came immediately. Too immediately. Claire nodded. "You must miss it." "Often." Again, the answer arrived without hesitation. Claire's smile remained warm. "I imagined so." Then she walked away. Nothing about her expression changed. Nothing about her voice suggested doubt. Yet if Ethan had been watching more carefully, he might have noticed the tiny pause before she left. A pause lasting less than a second. Near the kitchen, one of the cooks asked how her evening was going. "Quiet," Claire replied. The cook laughed. "That gentleman near the window does not look quiet." Claire glanced toward Ethan. "No, he enjoys stories." The cook smiled. "Good stories." Claire picked up another tray. Very detailed stories. Back at his table, Ethan felt increasingly confident. Every response from Claire seemed to confirm his assumptions. She never challenged him, never questioned inconsistencies, never displayed the slightest sign of suspicion. To Ethan, that meant the experiment was working. He could not have been more mistaken. A little later, Claire returned to refill his coffee. Steam rose from the fresh cup. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind him. "You travel quite a bit," she said casually. Ethan nodded. "Almost constantly. That must require learning many languages." The question pleased him. "Several." Claire smiled. "That is impressive." Ethan leaned back comfortably. "Language opens doors." "It certainly does." For a brief moment, their eyes met. Claire's expression remained perfectly pleasant. Yet something subtle shifted beneath the conversation. The first move had been made. Ethan did not realize it, but Claire had finally decided to step onto the chessboard. Not to expose him, not to embarrass him, simply to understand why a man would work so hard pretending to be someone else. As she walked away, Ethan watched her with growing curiosity. He believed he was studying her reactions. In reality, she had quietly begun studying his. And unlike Ethan, Claire was interested in something deeper than whether a stranger could detect an accent. She wanted to know what truth a person might be hiding beneath it. The rain outside had softened into a steady mist by the time Ethan Whitmore finished his dinner. The city beyond the windows looked blurred and distant, as though someone had painted the skyline with watercolors. Inside the Maple House, however, everything remained sharp. Every conversation, every glance, every carefully chosen word. Ethan found himself paying less attention to the food and more attention to Claire Bennett. That alone surprised him. Normally, his little experiments ended quickly. People either passed his silent test or failed it. Claire seemed determined to do neither. She simply continued being herself. That made her impossible to categorize. When she returned to clear his plate, Ethan decided to steer the conversation toward deeper waters. "You mentioned earlier that people are more interesting than places." Claire stacked the dishes carefully. "I believe that." "Why?" She considered the question for a moment. "Because places rarely surprise me." Ethan smiled. "And people do?" "Every day." The answer sounded sincere. Ethan leaned back. "Even after working in a restaurant for years?" Claire laughed softly. "Especially after working in a restaurant for years." The response amused him. "You must hear quite a few stories. More than most people realize." Ethan nodded. "I suppose that teaches you how to read character." Claire looked toward the rain outside. "Sometimes." "And what do you think of me?" The question arrived casually. Too casually. Claire immediately recognized it for what it was. Another test. Another invitation to reveal something. Yet her expression remained unchanged. "I think you enjoy observing people." Ethan smiled. "That is true. I think you are intelligent." "Also true. And I think you are trying very hard to create a certain impression." For the first time all evening, Ethan felt a small ripple of surprise. Not fear, not concern, just surprise. Yet Claire immediately smiled and lifted the empty plate. "Would you like dessert?" The moment passed so smoothly it almost seemed imaginary. Ethan stared after her as she walked away. Had she meant something by that statement? Or was he imagining it? For the first time since arriving, uncertainty appeared. Near the service station, Claire entered another order while quietly replaying the conversation. She had no interest in embarrassing Ethan. In fact, she found him oddly likable beneath the performance. The problem was not the accent itself. The problem was that he seemed more interested in testing people than connecting with them. That difference mattered. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a slice of apple pie and a fresh cup of coffee. Ethan smiled. "You chose for me? You look like someone who would appreciate pie on a rainy night." He laughed. "That is surprisingly accurate." Claire placed the dessert in front of him. "People can be predictable." Ethan studied her. "Not you." Claire smiled but offered no response. Instead, she glanced briefly at the old silver watch on her wrist before turning to leave. The gesture caught Ethan's attention. It was the third time he had noticed it that evening. "Family heirloom?" he asked. Claire looked down at the watch. Her expression softened slightly. "Something like that." Ethan nodded. "It seems important. It reminds me to pay attention." The answer lingered between them. "Pay attention." Ethan watched her disappear into the dining room and felt something unexpected. The strange sensation that perhaps he was no longer directing the conversation. Somewhere during the evening, the balance had shifted. Claire was still smiling, still serving coffee, still asking polite questions. Yet with each passing minute, Ethan felt as though he was slowly walking toward a truth she had already discovered. The only mystery remaining was how long it would take him to find it himself. The evening moved steadily toward 9 o'clock. Outside, the rain had become little more than a silver mist drifting across the city streets. Inside the Maple House, customers lingered over coffee and dessert while soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. The atmosphere encouraged conversation, reflection, the kind of moments when people revealed more than they intended. Ethan Whitmore stared out the window for a moment before turning his attention back toward Claire Bennett. The conversation had become far more interesting than he expected. Usually his tests produced predictable results. People either tried to impress him or ignored him. Claire seemed interested in neither. She simply listened, observed, waited. It unsettled him in a way he could not explain. When she returned to check on his dessert, Ethan decided to push the performance further. "You know," he said, maintaining the accent flawlessly, "I grew up near the coast before attending university overseas." Claire nodded politely. "That sounds beautiful." Ethan smiled. It was very different from life here. Claire glanced briefly at him. "I imagine it would be." Again, no challenge, no curiosity, no attempt to verify the story. Ethan almost wished she would ask questions. Instead, she simply gave him space to continue talking. Ironically, that made him talk more. "My family traveled constantly." "That must have been an interesting childhood." "Very much so." Claire smiled. "You seem to remember it clearly." "Of course." The answer came immediately, yet something about the exchange felt slightly off. Ethan could not identify why. Claire thanked another customer at a nearby table before returning her attention to him. "Memories can be funny," she said casually. "Sometimes we remember details perfectly. Other times we accidentally borrow details from other stories." Ethan laughed. "That sounds philosophical." "Perhaps." She shrugged lightly. "People tell themselves stories all the time." The comment lingered longer than it should have. Ethan smiled but felt a flicker of discomfort. Not because the statement accused him of anything, because it sounded strangely relevant. Claire moved away before he could respond. Near the service station, she entered another order while quietly reflecting on the evening. She had recognized the accent nearly the moment Ethan walked through the door. Not because it was terrible. In fact, it was remarkably good. Most people would never question it. The problem was consistency. Certain sounds belonged to one region. Others belonged to another. Tiny details contradicted one another. The mistakes were subtle, yet once noticed, impossible to ignore. Claire happened to notice such things. Years earlier, before life brought her to Seattle, she had spent several years studying languages and international communication. Very few people knew that. She rarely mentioned it because there was rarely a reason to. Tonight seemed no different. Back at the table, Ethan found himself replaying parts of their conversation. The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. Had Claire recognized something? If she had, why say nothing? Most people who discovered a deception rushed to expose it. Claire seemed entirely uninterested in doing that. Somehow that bothered him more. A few minutes later she returned with fresh coffee. Steam rose gently from the cup. "Still enjoying the evening?" she asked. Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. "More than I expected." Claire smiled. "Good." Their eyes met briefly, calmly, respectfully, and for the first time all night, Ethan had the strange feeling that he was no longer evaluating Claire at all. He was beginning to wonder whether she had been evaluating him from the very beginning. The crowd inside the Maple House had begun to thin. A few tables remained occupied by late diners lingering over coffee and conversation, but the frantic energy of dinner service had faded into something calmer, softer, more reflective. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving the city streets shining beneath rows of streetlights. Ethan Whitmore sat alone near the window, staring into his coffee. For the first time all evening, he found himself distracted from the role he was playing. The accent still came naturally. The invented stories remained available whenever needed. Yet the performance was beginning to feel strangely unnecessary. Claire Bennett had never reacted the way he expected. She had not been impressed. She had not been dismissive. Most importantly, she had never treated him differently because of the identity he presented. That realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. When Claire approached to check on his coffee, Ethan looked up. "Busy night?" he asked. Claire glanced around the dining room. "Not anymore." "You seem relieved." "I like this part of the evening." Ethan smiled. "Why?" Claire looked toward a nearby table where an elderly couple sat quietly sharing dessert. People stopped rushing. The answer seemed simple, yet Ethan found himself considering it. Claire noticed his expression and smiled. Most interesting things happen when people stop trying so hard. The comment lingered between them. Ethan laughed softly. You make everything sound like a lesson. That is probably a bad habit. No, he shook his head. I think it is unusual. Claire refilled his cup. Unusual is not always bad. Ethan watched her carefully. You know, I have met people all over the world. I imagine you have. Some of them were very successful. I am sure. Some were brilliant. Claire nodded. That must have been interesting. Ethan smiled. You keep answering questions without actually agreeing with me. Claire laughed quietly. Maybe I just enjoy listening. Her response drew an unexpected smile from him. For a moment, the conversation felt completely genuine. Then Ethan made a mistake. A small one. So small most people would never have noticed. Back home, he said casually, we used to drink coffee much stronger than this. Claire paused while setting down the coffee pot. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Back home, Ethan nodded. Of course. Claire smiled. I thought you said your family moved constantly when you were growing up. The question arrived gently, almost casually. Ethan immediately felt something tighten inside him. The problem was not the question itself. The problem was that he had forgotten which version of the story he told earlier. Claire's expression remained perfectly pleasant. She was not trapping him. She was not challenging him. She simply remembered. Ethan recovered quickly. We traveled often, but there was still a place we considered home. Claire nodded. That makes sense. Then she moved on as if nothing had happened. Yet the moment lingered. Ethan stared into his coffee after she left. For the first time all evening, he realized Claire was paying attention to every detail. Not because she wanted to catch him, because she genuinely listened. Most people heard words. Claire heard patterns, consistency, meaning. Across the restaurant, she helped another customer settle a bill. Her smile remained warm. Her movements remained calm. Nothing about her suggested victory. Yet Ethan suddenly understood something important. He was no longer leading the conversation. Claire had not exposed a lie. She had merely illuminated a crack in it. And now, for the first time since walking through the door, Ethan found himself wondering how many other cracks she had quietly noticed from the very beginning. The small inconsistency should have been insignificant. A single detail. A single sentence. Yet Ethan Whitmore found himself thinking about it long after Claire Bennett walked away. Most people forgot conversations almost immediately. Claire seemed to remember everything. Not in a dramatic way. Not with the intention of proving anyone wrong. She simply listened carefully. The realization forced Ethan into unfamiliar territory. For years he had been the observer, the evaluator, the person asking questions while others revealed themselves. Tonight, for perhaps the first time in a long while, the roles felt reversed. The restaurant had grown quieter. A few customers remained scattered throughout the dining room. Soft reflections danced across the windows where rain still clung to the glass. Claire moved gracefully between tables, helping guests settle checks and clearing empty dishes. She appeared completely relaxed. Ethan suspected otherwise. Surely she knew something. Surely she had noticed more than she revealed. When she returned with the check presenter, he looked up. You seem very observant. Claire smiled. Occupational hazard. Most people do not remember details the way you do. Details are usually there for a reason. Ethan studied her carefully. And what reasons do you think you have noticed tonight? Claire laughed softly. That sounds like a dangerous question. Why? Because people rarely enjoy hearing what they already know. The answer caught him off guard. For a moment neither spoke. Then Claire glanced toward the window. Besides, assumptions can be misleading. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like experience talking. It usually is. Her calmness never wavered. Yet Ethan sensed something beneath it. Not judgment. Understanding. As if she had encountered similar situations before. Have you always worked in restaurants? He asked. Claire hesitated briefly. Not always. What did you do before? Several things. Ethan smiled. That is a very vague answer. Claire laughed. It is also accurate. He found himself smiling too. Somehow she managed to answer questions without fully answering them. The difference was that Claire never seemed deceptive. She simply protected certain parts of herself. Ethan suddenly wondered whether he had spent so much time creating identities that he no longer recognized the value of authenticity. The thought lingered. A few minutes later, Claire returned carrying a coffee pot. "One more refill?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Please." She poured carefully. Steam rose between them. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the quiet space. Then Claire spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan felt an unexpected spark of curiosity. "Of course. Why do you travel so much?" The question seemed simple, yet it landed differently than all the others. Ethan opened his mouth, prepared to deliver another polished answer from the fictional biography he had created. Then he stopped. For the first time all evening, the prepared response felt hollow. Claire waited patiently. No pressure, no expectation, just genuine curiosity. Ethan finally smiled. "I am not entirely sure anymore." The answer surprised even him. Claire nodded as though it made perfect sense. "That is probably the most honest thing anyone has said in here tonight." The words were gentle, playful even, yet they settled heavily in the air between them. Ethan stared at her for a moment. Claire simply smiled and adjusted the coffee pot. She had not accused him of lying, had not challenged the accent, had not questioned a single story, but somehow, with one sentence, she had moved closer to the truth than anyone else ever had. And as she walked away, Ethan found himself staring at the reflection in the window beside him. For the first time all evening, he was no longer wondering what Claire thought of him. He was beginning to wonder what he thought of himself. For several minutes after Claire walked away, Ethan Whitmore remained completely still. The restaurant around him continued operating as usual. Glasses clinked softly. Chairs shifted against polished floors. Quiet conversations drifted through the warm air. Yet none of it held his attention. His mind remained fixed on a single sentence. "That is probably the most honest thing anyone has said in here tonight." The words had not sounded accusatory. That was what made them so powerful. Claire Bennett had not challenged him. She had not exposed him. She had simply acknowledged a rare moment of authenticity when it appeared. Ethan found himself wondering how long it had been since someone responded to honesty rather than performance. Across the dining room, Claire continued helping customers prepare to leave. She thanked people for visiting, carried empty cups back toward the kitchen, smiled at a young couple celebrating an anniversary. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was involved in any kind of psychological contest. Yet Ethan increasingly suspected she understood the evening better than he did. Eventually, she returned to his table with the check presenter. "No rush," she said gently. "Take your time." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Claire started to walk away. Then Ethan spoke. "Can I ask you another question?" She turned back. "Of course." Ethan looked toward the rain-speckled window. "Do people ever surprise you in a good way?" Claire smiled immediately. "Every week." "Really? Sometimes every day?" Ethan seemed genuinely curious. "Even after seeing all kinds of behavior?" Claire nodded. "Especially after that." She folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. "Most people are carrying something you cannot see." Ethan studied her expression. "That sounds optimistic." "Maybe." Claire glanced toward her grandfather's watch. "Or maybe it is just experience." The answer lingered. Ethan looked down at the check, then back at her. "And what if someone is pretending to be something they are not?" Claire's eyes softened slightly. "Most people do that sometimes." The response surprised him. "You think so?" "Of course." She smiled gently. "Some people pretend to be stronger than they feel. Some pretend to be happier. Some pretend they do not care what others think." Ethan laughed quietly. "And some pretend to be from another country?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Claire did not react. Not visibly. She simply tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps." Then she smiled. "The question is usually why." Ethan stared at her. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Claire had not confirmed anything. Yet somehow she had answered everything. She knew. Not just suspected. Knew. The realization arrived with surprising clarity. She had known for hours. And she had chosen not to embarrass him. Not once. A strange mixture of admiration and discomfort settled over him. Most people would have rushed toward the opportunity. They would have exposed the mistake, claimed victory, proved they were right. Claire seemed interested in none of those things. Instead, she was interested in understanding people. Ethan looked down at the check again. His reflection appeared faintly in the polished surface of the window beside him. For years he had convinced himself that testing people revealed character. Yet tonight another possibility emerged. Perhaps character was revealed not by how people responded to deception. Perhaps it was revealed by how they handled the truth once they discovered it. Across the room, Claire helped an elderly customer with a coat and wished him a safe drive home. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Ethan found himself watching. Not because it was remarkable, because it was genuine. And for the first time all evening, the role he had carefully constructed began to feel less important than the person hiding behind it. Somewhere between the first cup of coffee and the final check, the experiment had quietly changed direction. Ethan simply had not realized it until now. The realization stayed with Ethan Whitmore long after Claire Bennett stepped away from the table. She knew, not because she had exposed him, not because she had confronted him, because she had quietly acknowledged the possibility and then chosen kindness over correction. That choice unsettled him more than any public embarrassment ever could have. The Maple House was nearing closing time. A few remaining customers lingered over coffee while employees moved through their final routines of the evening. The atmosphere had become calm and intimate. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Reflections of city lights shimmered across the wet pavement beyond the windows. Ethan glanced at the check resting beside his coffee cup. He should have left already. The experiment was over. Yet he remained seated. Not because he still wanted to test Claire. Because he suddenly wanted to understand her. When she returned to clear a nearby table, Ethan stood and approached the counter where she was organizing receipts. "Can I ask one last question?" Claire looked up and smiled. "You seem to have an endless supply of them." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe." Claire placed a receipt into a folder. "What is the question?" Ethan hesitated. For perhaps the first time all evening, he was unsure how to begin. "Why did you never say anything?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "About what?" Ethan smiled. "You know exactly what." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire glanced down at the old silver watch on her wrist before looking back up. "Because it did not seem necessary." Ethan stared at her. "That is all. That is all." Her answer arrived without hesitation. Ethan shook his head. Most people would have pointed it out. Claire considered that. "Maybe. You never even hinted at it." This time Claire laughed quietly. "I think I hinted quite a bit." Ethan could not help smiling. She was right. Looking back, the entire evening had been filled with gentle observations. Small questions. Thoughtful pauses. Not accusations. Invitations. Opportunities for honesty he had repeatedly ignored. The realization brought an unexpected sense of embarrassment. Not because he had been caught. Because he had missed what was actually happening. "You knew from the beginning?" he asked. Claire leaned lightly against the counter. "Not from the first sentence." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really? It took almost 2 minutes." He laughed despite himself. "That is not encouraging." Claire smiled. "Your accent was very good. Very good. Most people would never notice." Ethan nodded slowly. "But you did. I studied languages years ago." The mystery finally made sense. Ethan looked out toward the dining room. "So all evening you were listening to me tell stories you knew were not true." Claire followed his gaze. "Some of them were not true." The distinction caught his attention. "Some." Claire nodded. "The places changed. The details changed. The accent changed." She paused. "But certain things felt honest." Ethan remained silent. Claire continued gently. "The loneliness sounded real." The words landed with surprising weight. Ethan looked away. For the first time that evening, neither of them smiled. Not because the conversation had become uncomfortable, because it had become genuine. Claire had quietly separated the fiction from the person creating it. She had seen through the performance without dismissing the individual behind it. And standing there beneath the warm lights of a nearly empty restaurant, Ethan suddenly realized that the biggest lie he had exposed that night was not the accent. It was the belief that nobody would notice the truth hiding underneath it. The dining room had grown almost silent. Only 3 tables remained occupied, and even those customers were preparing to leave. Employees moved through closing routines with practiced efficiency. Chairs were being stacked in unused sections. Receipts were organized. Coffee machines hummed softly in the background. Yet near the counter, time seemed to slow. Ethan Whitmore stood quietly across from Claire Bennett, still thinking about her last observation. The loneliness sounded real. No accusation could have affected him more deeply, because it was true. The accent had been fabricated. The stories had been altered. The identity had been carefully constructed. But the loneliness had never been part of the act. Claire returned to organizing receipts while giving him space to think. She seemed to understand that some conversations required silence more than words. After a few moments, Ethan spoke. "Do you know why I started doing this?" Claire glanced up. "The accent." He nodded. "Yes." She considered the question. I imagine you had a reason. Ethan laughed softly. That sounds diplomatic. Occupational habit. A faint smile crossed his face. Then it disappeared. At first it was curiosity. Claire listened. People treated me differently when they knew who I was. I can imagine. Every conversation felt predictable. Ethan looked toward the nearly empty dining room. People wanted something. Access. Approval. Opportunities. Claire remained silent. So one day I decided to remove my name from the equation. He smiled slightly. The accent came later. Claire nodded. And what happened? Ethan leaned against the counter. At first it felt liberating. But Ethan laughed quietly. But eventually I could not tell the difference between genuine curiosity and another performance. The honesty surprised even him. Claire listened carefully. Not interrupting. Not rushing to respond. Just listening. That sounds exhausting, she finally said. Ethan smiled. It was. For a moment, neither spoke. Then a server walked past carrying a stack of menus and wished Claire good night. She smiled and returned the farewell before turning back toward Ethan. Can I tell you something? She asked. Of course. Claire glanced down at the old watch on her wrist. People are usually not as interested in titles as we think they are. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You believe that? Most of the time. She smiled gently. People remember how you make them feel. The simplicity of the statement struck him. Ethan thought back over the evening. Not once had Claire seemed interested in status. Not once had she tried to discover what he did for a living. She had paid attention to his words, his behavior, his mood, nothing else. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Earlier in the evening, he had told 3 slightly different versions of the same story. Different places, different details, different timelines. Claire had noticed every inconsistency, yet she never challenged them. Not because she missed them, because she was paying attention to something more important. The person telling them. Ethan shook his head slowly. I spent the entire evening trying to figure out whether you could see through me. Claire smiled. And? Ethan laughed. Apparently you could. Not entirely. No. Claire's expression softened. You are more than the stories. The words settled heavily between them. More than the stories. Ethan stared at the counter for a moment. Throughout his life, he had become very skilled at creating versions of himself. Executive, founder, investor, traveler, stranger with an accent. Yet standing there beneath the warm lights of a closing restaurant, he realized Claire had never been interested in any of those versions. She had been patiently waiting for the real conversation to begin, and for the first time all evening, he felt ready to have it. The final customers left shortly after 10 o'clock. The front door opened and closed one last time, allowing a brief rush of cool night air into the restaurant before silence settled over the room. Outside, the streets shimmered beneath reflections of city lights. Inside, the Maple House belonged only to the employees finishing their shifts and to 2 people standing near the counter, engaged in a conversation neither had expected when the evening began. Ethan Whitmore looked around the nearly empty restaurant and felt something unusual. Relief. The performance had become exhausting. Not because maintaining the accent was difficult, because maintaining distance was. Claire Bennett had quietly dismantled that distance one conversation at a time. Not through confrontation. Through patience. You know, Ethan said, I spent years believing I was good at reading people. Claire smiled. You probably are. Ethan laughed softly. That sounds generous considering how tonight turned out. I do not think tonight turned out badly. Ethan looked at her for a moment. You do not. Claire shook her head. No. She organized a few remaining receipts before continuing. People learn things about themselves all the time. Usually it is uncomfortable. Ethan smiled. That is one way to describe it. A moment of silence passed. Then, almost instinctively, Ethan began speaking again. There was one thing that should have given me away immediately. Claire raised an eyebrow. Only one. He laughed. Fair point. Then his expression became thoughtful. I told you earlier that I spent several months in Austria last year. Claire nodded. You did. The problem is that I also mentioned attending a conference in Singapore during that same period. Claire smiled, but said nothing. Then later I claimed I was visiting family in another country at the exact same time. Ethan shook his head. I practically exposed myself. Claire's smile widened slightly. You were managing a lot of details. That is a polite way of saying I was making things up. Claire laughed quietly. You said it, not me. Ethan joined her laughter. For the first time all evening, The tension surrounding the deception seemed to dissolve. The truth no longer felt threatening. It felt freeing. "Why did you never stop me?" he asked. Claire considered the question. "Because you were already doing it yourself." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Claire glanced toward the empty dining room. "Every time a story changed, you looked less interested in telling it." The observation caught him completely off guard. He thought back through the evening and realized she was right. The longer the performance continued, the less energy he invested in it. Not because he feared being discovered, because part of him wanted to stop pretending. Claire continued softly. "People usually reveal the truth long before they speak it." Ethan stared at her. "That sounds like something a psychologist would say." "I am definitely not a psychologist." "Then how do you know?" Claire smiled and looked down at her grandfather's watch. Years of paying attention. The answer felt simple, yet it explained everything. Ethan suddenly understood that Claire had never won because she was smarter. She had never tried to win at all. While he focused on testing her knowledge, she focused on understanding his behavior. While he looked for weaknesses, she looked for reasons. That difference changed everything. The game he believed he was playing had ended hours ago. He simply had not noticed the moment it happened. And standing beneath the warm lights of a quiet restaurant, Ethan realized the most revealing mistake of the night was not a failed accent or an inconsistent story. It was assuming that intelligence announces itself loudly. Claire had never needed to prove what she knew. She simply allowed the truth enough room to reveal itself. The clock above the kitchen doorway showed nearly 11 o'clock. Most of the staff had finished their duties and headed home. Only a few employees remained, completing final tasks before locking the doors for the night. The Maple House felt different now. Larger, quieter. The rush of the evening had disappeared, leaving behind only warm light, empty tables, and the lingering scent of coffee. Claire Bennett stood near the counter balancing receipts, while Ethan Whitmore remained nearby. The conversation had drifted far away from accents, invented stories, and harmless tests. What remained felt surprisingly real. For several moments, neither spoke. There was no awkwardness in the silence, only reflection. Finally, Ethan smiled. "You know what the strange part is?" Claire looked up. "What?" "I came here planning to learn something about someone else." Claire laughed softly. "And?" Ethan glanced around the empty restaurant. "Instead, I spent the entire evening learning something about myself." Claire nodded as though that outcome seemed perfectly reasonable. "That happens sometimes." Ethan shook his head. "You make major life lessons sound like weather reports." The comment drew a genuine laugh from her. "That is probably another bad habit." Ethan smiled. Then his expression grew more thoughtful. "Can I ask you one last honest question?" Claire placed the receipts aside. "You have earned at least one." Ethan took a slow breath. "When did you realize I was testing you?" The answer came immediately. "Almost right away." Ethan laughed. "I should have guessed." Claire smiled. The accent was only part of it. What was the other part? She considered the question carefully. Most people ask questions because they want to know something. Ethan listened. You asked questions because you wanted to measure something. The observation landed with remarkable precision. Ethan looked down and nodded slowly. She was right. The entire evening had begun with evaluation, observation, judgment disguised as curiosity. Claire continued gently. "There is nothing wrong with being curious. But people are not puzzles." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds like another lesson." "Maybe." Claire glanced at the old silver watch resting against her wrist. "People usually tell you who they are if you give them enough room." Ethan stared at her for a moment. Then something changed. Without thinking, he spoke his next words in his natural voice. No accent, no performance, no disguise, just himself. "I think I forgot that." The difference was subtle but unmistakable. The carefully practiced European sound vanished completely. Claire noticed immediately. Of course she did. Yet her expression never changed. She simply smiled. Warmly, respectfully, as though she had been waiting for this moment all evening. Ethan laughed softly when he realized what he had done. "Well," Claire smiled. "There you are." The words settled between them like the final piece of a puzzle. Not because she had exposed him, because she had welcomed him. For the first time that night, Ethan felt no need to perform, no need to impress, no need to test anyone. The strange weight he had been carrying seemed to disappear. Claire picked up a coffee pot and poured 2 small cups. One for him, one for herself. The restaurant was technically closed. Neither seemed concerned. Steam rose gently between them. Outside, the city lights reflected across the wet streets. Inside, two people sat quietly at the counter sharing coffee and conversation. No games. No experiments. No disguises. Ethan looked at Claire and smiled. You knew all along. Claire wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Most of it. And you never once tried to prove you were right. Claire shrugged lightly. Being right was never the interesting part. Ethan nodded slowly. Looking around the quiet restaurant, he finally understood. The evening had never been about whether a waitress could detect a fake accent. It had been about whether someone possessed enough wisdom to see through a performance without humiliating the person behind it. And sitting across from Claire Bennett, Ethan realized he had finally met someone who did. The last chair was placed upside down on the final table just after 11 o'clock. The lights inside the Maple House dimmed slightly as the closing routine came to an end. Outside, Seattle shimmered beneath fresh rain and reflected city lights. Inside, an unusual sense of peace settled over the restaurant. Claire Bennett sat quietly at the counter with a warm cup of coffee in her hands. Across from her sat Ethan Whitmore, no longer hiding behind an accent, a story, or a carefully constructed identity. For a while they simply talked. About ordinary things. Favorite books. Places they hoped to visit one day. Memories that mattered. The conversation flowed more naturally than anything that had come before it. Ironically, once the performance ended, the real connection began. Ethan found himself laughing more easily, speaking more honestly, listening more carefully. At one point he glanced toward the rain-speckled windows and shook his head. I cannot believe I spent hours pretending to be someone else. Claire smiled into her coffee. Most people spend much longer than that. Ethan laughed. That sounds like another lesson. Maybe. He looked at her for a moment. You know, when I walked in here tonight, I thought intelligence was about noticing mistakes. Claire tilted her head slightly. And now? Ethan glanced around the empty restaurant. Now I think it might be about knowing what to do after you notice them. For a moment Claire said nothing. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that appears when someone says something they genuinely mean. That is a better definition. Ethan nodded slowly. The truth felt strangely liberating. Throughout the evening he had expected to uncover something about another person. Instead, Claire had quietly revealed something about him. Not through criticism, not through humiliation, through dignity. She had seen through every inconsistency, every contradiction, every carefully crafted detail. Yet she never used that knowledge as a weapon. She simply gave the truth room to arrive on its own. And when it finally did, she welcomed it. The clock continued ticking softly above the kitchen doorway. Ethan reached for the check he had never paid and placed several bills inside the folder. Then he added a handwritten note beneath the receipt. Not a performance, not a test, just a simple sentence. When Claire eventually opened it, she found 6 words written carefully across the paper. Thank you for seeing the person. She stared at the note for a moment before smiling quietly. When she looked up, Ethan was already standing near the door. Their eyes met one final time across the nearly empty restaurant. No dramatic speeches followed. No grand revelations. Only mutual respect. Ethan placed a hand on the door and paused. For what it is worth, he said, you were the smartest person in the room tonight. Claire laughed softly. That is because nobody else was left. Ethan smiled. Then he stepped outside into the cool night air. The door closed gently behind him. Claire remained at the counter for another moment, holding the note in her hand. Beyond the windows, the city continued moving as it always had. People hurried through sidewalks. Cars passed beneath streetlights. Somewhere, countless strangers were still trying to prove themselves to one another. Claire folded the note carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket beside her grandfather's watch. Then she turned off the final light and prepared to go home. Some victories arrive loudly. Others arrive quietly, wrapped in understanding, patience, and grace. The ones that matter most are often the quiet ones. Because real intelligence does not need applause. Real dignity does not need revenge. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who chooses kindness when they already know the truth. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below about a moment when kindness taught someone a lesson that pride never could. And if stories like this remind you that character matters more than appearances, consider joining us again for another quiet story about the people who change lives without ever raising their voices.